But you made reference to the fact that when you were born, the advice that your parents were given by doctors was to forget about you, to abandon you, and not to let you survive. There are still parents of people with disabilities being told that in Canada virtually every day.
Hello, and welcome to the Disability Network. I'm Susan Pettit.
And I'm Joe Coughlin.
Joe, as you just saw, I have a personal interest in our first story, and a little later in the show, I'll tell you why.
Okay.
This is a story about parents and babies. Until recently, one didn't know if a baby was disabled until it was born. Now, thanks to technology, you can tell. This raises important ethical questions. Should the fetus be aborted? And if so, when?
Diane Richler is Executive Vice President of the Canadian Association for Community Living. It's an organization that advocates for people with mental handicaps. Richler is concerned that Canada's proposed abortion bill, Bill C-43, could discriminate against people with disabilities.
Generally, abortions are not permitted after the fetus is considered viable. That's usually between 20 and 23 weeks into the pregnancy. However, according to Richler, the background notes to the bill seem to say that an abortion can be performed after the viability period if the fetus is diagnosed as being abnormal.
Barbara Green is a member of the Parliamentary Committee conducting hearings into the bill. She says Richler's group has nothing to fear from the bill. We brought the two women together to share their views. Here's part of what they told us. First, Diane Richler.
We know that infants with mental handicaps are being denied treatment at birth and throughout life by the medical community who doesn't value their lives. Our membership, which includes people who have disabilities and their families, find that very disturbing, both in terms of the threat to those unborn children and to the young children who are being denied services and medical treatment, but it's also extremely devaluing to the disabled members of our community now and what we're saying about them. What we're saying to every person with a disability is, if we had had the choice, we would have kept you from being born.
Right.
We really don't want you here, but you're here, and so we have to accommodate.
Well, could I just respond to that? Because I don't think that's exactly what's happening. With this particular bill, it's being left up to the judgment of the mother and the doctor as to whether or not her health is affected. But I think that there are many, many people in our society that would choose to have a child that was disabled. I think they do it every day. I think your parents chose. And I think to say that our society has, that everybody would make a different choice is wrong. I know my family, we come from a Roman Catholic background. I have relatives that have chosen to have disabled children and have coped with those handicaps and so on. I think that some families don't feel that they can cope with this particular problem, and it may indeed affect the health of the mother.
But what do you think the status is of the background notes that specifically suggest that in the case of a fetal abnormality, that there would be a double standard, that the background notes clearly say that abortions could be performed after the point of viability in the case of handicap?
Well, I think that the Canadian Medical Association guidelines are what has to be followed, because it's clearly placing the onus on the doctors to act in accordance with their guidelines. And so far as I'm aware, doctors in Canada will not kill viable fetuses simply because they're disabled.
Unfortunately, we know of cases where they've killed babies.
I think that's unethical.
Susan, what happened when you were born?
Well, Joe, as you know, I was born with cystic fibrosis, and in fact, I celebrated my 38th birthday on April Fool's Day. And I guess you could say that I fooled them all. I'm one of the oldest in Canada now. And if my parents had listened to the advice of some doctors, I probably wouldn't be here to tell the story. Basically, there wasn't much hope given, and what were they going to do with me? Don't cry over this baby. But my dad had a friend who was also a doctor, and his advice was, you get this baby to sick kids. So my aunt and my dad took me out of the hospital and put me in my dad's television truck, and off we went with a police escort to sick children's where they did experimental surgery. And that actually was not supposed to work either, but here I am.
Good to have you here, too.
Thanks.
We'll be right back after these messages.
Standardization of the human product has been pushed to fantastic, though not perhaps impossible extremes. That's a quote from Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
The drive for independence can take many directions. In Stephen MacPherson's case, it's as simple as wanting to move into his own home. Suzanne spoke with MacPherson earlier this week.
Stephen MacPherson has a simple wish: to live on his own in an apartment he can call home. Unfortunately, it is only a dream. Stephen, 27, is a resident at West Park, a chronic care hospital in Toronto's West End. He is a quadriplegic who depends on a respirator to breathe. His goal is to set up an apartment project for disabled people like himself who depend on ventilators. This has never been done before in Ontario. Unfortunately for Stephen, government guidelines don't provide for independent residence care. They say there is a concern about liability. Stephen's goal of independence includes plans to operate a travel service for people with special needs. Right now, he is drafting architectural drawings for barrier-free buildings. Unable to move his arms, Stephen relies on his computer to do his work, operating it the same way he uses his power chair, by blowing air through a straw. To gain his independence, Stephen is willing to take a risk. If a ventilator should fail in a hospital with round-the-clock care, the risk is minimal. Anywhere else, it's a gamble, one that could cost Stephen his life. When the government finishes its review, it will decide on this issue of liability, and also decide whether Stephen MacPherson will spend his life in a chronic care hospital or in a home he can call his own. Mr. MacPherson, why do you want to move out of West Park?
I think two of the main reasons why I'd like to move out is that the limited space. I've got one corner of a fairly small room and the lack of privacy. And, you know, just like any other 27-year-old, I'd like to have an apartment or, you know, a home of my own.
West Park can provide you with a full range of essential services. Can you still get these services if you move out?
Well, I don't need all the services that the RNs and RNAs provide. A lot of my care can be done by tenants, and that's been proven by other people. I also try to set up a business. So the attendants, or I guess I really need some sort of a secretary that can help me with other duties.
Aren't you taking a big risk here, especially with your respirator needs?
There's a certain risk, but you just have to make sure that the attendants are trained properly and that the service contract is met.
I guess this also gives you more control over your own life.
Well, you said it right there, just to have more control.
Is independent living less expensive?
Yeah, it would be about half the price to keep me in my own apartment with support services. And even more expensive, if you can imagine, for people that are in acute care hospitals.
What's the biggest obstacle?
The big stall is with the ministries. You know, you can find money to do surveys, and but they know that they know where the gaps in service is, and they need to provide more money for housing, you know, in all cases, especially to move people like myself out in the community and make it a lot cheaper.
Mr. MacPherson, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Joining me now is Glen. She's the founder of the Committee for Independence in Living and Breathing. She's been active in promoting the concept of self-directed respiratory care. From time to time, she also acts as MacPherson's attendant. Karen, why do people like Stephen MacPherson have so much difficulty getting out of an institutional setting?
Well, Joe, there are probably three reasons. First of all, I think is just the general myth that people like Steve are a risk, that there is a liability issue associated with allowing terrible phrase, but allowing someone like Steve to live outside of an institutional setting. There also is a terrific scarcity of affordable, accessible housing. And in addition, there just aren't enough funds available to provide the one-on-one support services that Steve would require to enable him to live independently.
Now, we have some some models out in British Columbia that seem to work because they've got people like Stephen living in the community once again. Why is that model not working here in Ontario?
Well, it hasn't been initiated in Ontario, which is really sad. In British Columbia, 6 young men escaped from Pearson Hospital, literally speaking with the help of the Canadian Paraplegic Association and the Ministry of Community and Social Services in BC. And together they fundraised and they negotiated a deal with the Ministry of Community and Social Services that they would assume responsibility for their own well-being. That is, they would not hold anyone responsible for anything that should happen to them should they be living outside of the hospital.
Let's talk about that risk situation. People with breathing apparatuses are taking their life into their own hands. Why do they want to do something like that? Why should they, I guess, entrust that life-giving thing to somebody who's not a professional?
For the same reason that you or anyone else wants to have quality of life, everyone has the right to having quality of life and to making choices in life. Steve and other people like Steve have the right to live in the community, the right to go to school, the right to be employed, to be married, to work in the community, and to make choices of their own. They're perfectly capable, independent young people, and it's a crime for them to be living in institutions. The 6 young men who formed Creekview, which is the group home setting in British Columbia, are now all in a position to move beyond that setting into independent apartments with the necessary attendant care. 2 of them are employed. One man is married now and is really, really involved in doing advocacy work and peer counseling and teaching, and the other 2 are going to school. So the same situation could be possible in Ontario with adequate dollars and with the commitment from the provincial government to make this happen.
Ms. Glen, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Joining me now is Charles Beer. He's the Minister of Community and Social Services for the province of Ontario, and he's responsible for the future direction of long-term care. Welcome to our show.
Pleasure to be here.
There's lots of money to go around in lots of different programs. Why is there no money for Stephen MacPherson and others like him?
Well, increasingly, there is more money, and I think that it's part of our commitment to ensure that those people with varying disabilities, in fact, have an option to live in the community. And I think we see that as a fundamental element of our programs, and we've got to continue to do a better job.
When can someone like Stephen expect to see some changes?
Well, there are changes going on in a sense right now in that we are enabling and working with people to ensure that they can go into the community. But there are 2 specific things that are happening. One is the Long-Term Care Initiative. We'll be releasing in early May a white paper, and that initiative is going to be putting many more resources into the community so that people now in institutions can go into the community. The second thing that we're doing is we're carrying out a survey of those with what I suppose one might call higher medical needs, so that we can find out from those with those needs, from their parents, friends, the people working with them, okay, what do you need in order to be able to live in the community, and how can we ensure that that happens?
How about liability? How important is that question?
Well, it is important, but I think I'd put it more in the context that as minister, I'm concerned about the safety of the people who move from institutions into community settings, and I want to make sure that in fact we have the resources there so that Stephen will be as safe in the community as he is in the institution that he's now in. And I think we can overcome that. I think we'll work that out.
What's your message to Stephen MacPherson and others like him?
Well, I think, frankly, as I sat and watched him, I think that it instills in all of us that we've got to do more, we've got to do it more quickly, and that he really exemplifies the human spirit that says, I'm not going to be put down by this disability. And we can all learn from that, and we're going to make sure that he gets into his own home.
Mr. Beer, thank you.
Thank you.
Health professionals often assume that people who are physically disabled are dependent. Thus, many people with disabilities learn how to be dependent on healthcare professionals. That's from the Centre for Research and Education in Human Services in Kitchener, Ontario. Well over half of Canada's disabled population is unemployed. Some put the figures as high as 80%. One reason is that few employers know disabled people firsthand. And this is why the integration of disabled students in the regular schools is so important. Day-to-day, contact quickly breaks down the barriers of fear and ignorance. Across Canada, increasing numbers of schools are opening their doors to disabled students. One is Assumption College, a Catholic high school in Windsor, Ontario. We have this report by Paul Jones.
This used to be considered no place for a blind kid, but for the last 4 years, Christine Trudel has been just another one of the students at the Assumption College School in Windsor. Trudel's been almost totally blind since birth. Like most blind children, she was sent to a special school. For Trudel, it was a school in Brantford. But after grade 9, Trudel decided to leave the familiarity of school in Brantford and join the mainstream.
Now I know what it's like to be in an environment where most of the students and staff are have their full vision.
It wasn't an easy decision. Trudel had to adjust to the school, and the school to Christine.
It was quite difficult at first because I had to learn what her needs were, and then I had to try and address those issues to the classroom teachers.
It almost didn't work. Trudel thought about going back to Brantford.
Type 2, I should say.
But help came in the form of technology. The school got a computer system. Trudel used it to translate her notes and assignments into Braille. The computer helped her keep up. Trudel just graduated. She'll be in university this fall. And the Windsor Separate School Board is ready to handle more special needs students.
Let's hope it just wasn't an experiment, because I think we're going to see a lot of people taking advantage of mainstreaming and getting kids into just dealing with reality instead of institutionalizing them.
Already, Trudel's computer equipment is on its way to a blind boy who's in a mainstream grade 1 class. Paul Jones, CBC News, Windsor.
Robert Elton is with the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. He spoke with Susan earlier this week.
Mr. Elton, how many schools are there like Assumption College across Canada?
There are many. I wouldn't know necessarily the exact number, Susan, but I think it's safe to say that there are a lot of schools at both the elementary, secondary, and high school levels that are really beginning to take measures to accommodate blind and visually impaired students.
Do you find that there's much resistance to integration?
I think not in principle, but I think the reality is that when there are budgets in question and concerns on that score from the standpoint of school boards, then you get into real problems in some cases.
I see. Well, what then would CNIB's policy be with respect to school integration?
Well, certainly we support it, but we feel that it's only going to be true integration when the support services are in place for students so that they have the resources to enable them to function fully in the school system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
By the way, the CNIB provides a wide range of services for blind and visually impaired people who are seeking work. These services include evaluation, employment counseling, and vocational rehabilitation. We had a positive response to our first Language Watch feature last week. Since then, we have spotted the most no-no word of all in 2 magazines. The word is cripple. In Time magazine, Richard Nixon said former U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was crippled by polio. In the latest issue of Saturday Night, best-selling novelist Mordecai Richler stoutly defends the use of cripple. My God, the way our language is being mauled is truly maddening. When did the word crippled, good enough for Samuel Johnson, become pejorative?
We'll be sending Mordecai Richler a copy of this handy guide of preferred terms for disability issues. It's put out by the Ontario Office for Disabled Persons.
Here are a couple of international events coming up shortly. Disabled Persons International, DPI, is holding an international symposium on independent living. The event is taking place in Finland from May 5th to May 7th. DPI's headquarters is in Winnipeg. DPI will also be holding an income-generating seminar in Trinidad and Tobago from July 22nd till July 29th. And finally, our news update. Federal Transport Minister Benoit Bouchard's Advisory Committee on Accessible Transportation met for the first time this week in Ottawa. Bouchard says he is committed to the provision of an accessible national transportation system. Greg Pick, the Canadian Paraplegic Association's representative on the committee, says a long list of demands needs to be met before Canada's transportation system is truly accessible.
Well, we could have ramps on every single bus, inner-city bus in Canada. We could have electronic signs in every single bus in Canada for the hearing impaired. We could have a government committed to ensuring that disabled persons have access to rented cars in airports throughout Canada. We could ensure that wheelchairs are not lost in airports and through the airlines, which is commonly occurring. We can ensure that airline representatives are aware that we require wheelchairs every day, and they can't go on breaking them and destroying them, and they can store them properly and set regulations to do that. There's a whole broad area that the federal government has to seize here in order to make the transportation of disabled persons a much better environment. We're falling backwards, and we have fallen backwards for the last 5 years. And it's up to the government now and this committee to forge ahead with policies, with implementation, and with enforcement.
And two other stories caught our attention this week. A coroner's jury says Toronto's Don Jail should undertake a fundamental change in its attitude and approach toward mentally ill prisoners. An inquest into the death of a 30-year-old prisoner was told that the number of such prisoners being sent to the jail has reached a saturation point. And in Vancouver, Cody Stiles, who uses a wheelchair, has been hired as a parking meter attendant. Rejected for the job at first, he was hired when the Canadian Paraplegic Association and the city's Equal Opportunity Office intervened on his behalf.
Thanks, Joe. The mail is starting to come in from viewers across the country. As you know, Harry Beattie of the Advocacy Resource Centre for the Handicapped was on our show last week to give all of us some tax tips.
Right.
And here's a letter from Grace Pine of Port Colborne, Ontario. Caught your program on income tax for the disabled. It was very informative. My husband had a stroke in 1988, and my son is a double amputee, head injured in a car accident. Any information you can give me would be appreciated. Thank you, Grace, and we'll pass your letter on to Harry Beattie at Arch.
Peter Brannan of Chemainus, British Columbia writes, there's a human rights complaint in BC regarding scooter users and BC Transit. About 1.5 years ago, scooters were banned on HandyDart, BC Transit's system for the disabled. The claim was that scooters were unsafe to transport with occupants on them. I was one of those users. We fought a hectic fight and finally got a 15-month stay of execution. The hearings will go ahead this June. As you know, Susan, I just got a scooter myself this week, and I think it's quite safe and a heck of a lot of fun and a great way to get around.
Yeah, I want to give it a shot.
Sure.
We'd like to hear your comments.
Our address is the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6.
I've got something for you. This is called an Ultra 4 by Tash, which is Technical Aids and Systems for the Handicapped. It's a remote control system. And it can adjust lights, stereo, anything in your home from any room. This green button is hooked up to our lighting system in the studio. Give it a try. Ooh.
Wow, scary.
Up again?
Okay.
Hey,
very
good
neat.
for you. And that's our show for this week. We hope you've enjoyed it.
And keep those cards and letters coming in, folks. Remember, this is